Welcome to the Disrupt Your Career podcast, brought to you by Claire Harbour
and Antoine Tirant. We're passionate about helping everyone find fulfillment in their work life.
We believe that big, messy, uncharted career changes are inevitable, and it's up to you to decide.
Will you take control and disrupt, or allow yourself to be disrupted?
We wrote the book about it, and now we share here our conversations with other thinkers in this crucial area.
Settle down and get ready to listen to this dose of wisdom.
So welcome to this edition of the Disrupt Your Career podcast. Today we have with us Dorie Clark. She is an absolutely superlatively impressive woman and professional. I'm very honored to have her with us today on the podcast. She's ranked as one of the top 50 business thinkers in the world. She has an award as the #1 communication coach in the world. She's a professor of business at Duke and Columbia, an HBR author, and as the New York Times recently said, an expert at self-reinvention and helping others make changes in their lives. She's the author of 3 books: The Long Game, Entrepreneurial You, Reinventing You, and Stand Out, which was named the #1 leadership book of the year by Inc. magazine. Dorie, I feel super honored and overshadowed in every single way. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Claire. I appreciate your super kind introduction. But as we established before we started recording, I'm still working to figure out the Celsius scale. So we've all got our hills to climb.
Indeed we have. So there's so much we could be talking about today. We're going to try to keep it to a reasonable length of time. I should add that Dorie shared with me just how back-to-back books she was booked at the moment in terms of talking about and publicizing her latest book, which we'll get to. So I feel super grateful that you're here. Let's start with something really simple. Tell us about your own career narrative. You're a particularly great example, as are Antoine and I, of continuous career invention. You've been a journalist at the outset, a political spokesperson to a nonprofit director, not to mention the incredibly illustrious portfolio career you have now. How did your career evolve over time? And how did you find your North Star? And in hindsight, what did you learn and what advice do you have for all of us?
Well, thank you, Claire. I appreciate it. Although I'm not entirely sure that's a simple question because there's a lot of
answer that in 3 words, please.
That's right. Well, I would say that probably like a lot of people, I had a vision about what I wanted my career to be in my early 20s. And through a combination of societal change in the forms of things like the newspaper industry collapsing, and in the form of just gatekeepers and bad luck and things happening, like working for political campaigns that kept losing, I found myself stymied in a lot of ways. And so it took me a while to piece through together to the path to entrepreneurship and working for myself, which I've now been doing for the past 15 years. But ultimately, a lot of that process, at the time, of course, it's painful, it's upsetting. I got, laid off from my job as a journalist very abruptly and didn't really have any money because their idea of a generous severance was to give me 4 days of pay because I'd worked Monday. So they're like, well, here, we'll pay you through the end of the week. So, you have to think fast when you're in a situation like that, which is a little uncomfortable when you've just lost your job. But all of that did eventually set me up for the work that I do now and for writing The Long Game, which fundamentally is a book about how to persevere even when things look very bleak, and to begin to get a sense of when you should be pivoting versus when you should be barreling through. Because in the moment, it can be very, very hard to tell the difference. And these often feel like dark times when you get rejected by some person or some entity that you were really hoping for a break from. But there's a clear path that you can get through, but it's not always easy. So in The Long Game, I wanted to try to provide a bit of a framework and a guidebook to help people through those times.
Absolutely. And I think the key, whatever you call it, however you look at it, is that of being prepared, right? It's finding a way to manage your career such that even when the big surprises come, you've got some kind of a plan to be working with. Let's then go to the other end of the spectrum for a moment and talk about quitting. So one of your more recent HBR titles is, Are You Really Ready to Quit? So we know that, in this strange post-pandemic time, many people are actually leaving their jobs, and it can be a pretty obvious move for some. But we also know that some people are unclear about whether leaving their company will bring them the fruit that they hoped for. So what advice do you have for them?
Yeah, well, when it comes to quitting, obviously this has been talked about a lot, given the COVID situation. Studies have shown that anywhere from a quarter up to 50% of employees are actively considering leaving their jobs, which makes sense in a lot of ways. I mean, there's a combination of factors. The first one is just that people were, in the early days of the pandemic, much less likely to leave their jobs because who wants to leave their job in a pandemic? It seems a little dicey. So people held on longer than they probably statistically would have otherwise. So partly it's just pent up natural attrition. But also, of course, at the other end of the pandemic, hopefully, God willing, we're at the other end of the pandemic. People have been reevaluating things. People have been taking stock of their lives and what they want their lives to look like. And it raises questions. Is this the right field for me? Is this the right company for me? Is this the right position for me? And people are often more willing to make some changes in that. Also, we are seeing a historically tight job market. I mean, walking around the streets of New York, I am literally seeing signs of, I've just never seen this before in almost any business. You're seeing like, oh, please come make sandwiches for us. You'll get a 401k. I mean, I'm not even joking. Or, oh, we need barbers. You can make 6 figures a year. I'm like, are you freaking kidding me? Like, okay. I mean, like, hey, let's all be barbers. Mazel. It's wow. Like, wow, they're desperate. So there's a lot of opportunity for people. So I think this is a rather interesting and unique period at the moment where we do have a chance with probably a lot more of a safety net in the form of other job opportunities than we might normally have, to be able to ask some of those questions and determine what's right for us.
Indeed. Of course, that doesn't necessarily apply to every single segment of the global population, but it certainly does to very big chunks. And
especially if you have barber training.
Absolutely.
Never a bad thing.
I mean, I'm going to be calling all my friends who do. I wonder if they provide work visas as well.
I think that's probably not far off, Claire.
Yeah,
that's right. That's right. My barber is from Montenegro, and he has an entire salon staffed with Montenegrin barbers. It's very impressive.
Amazing. Tribes. Let's think about then, beyond the ease and uniqueness of the situation now, when there's really more or less no explanation needed if you suddenly decide to become a barber, having been a salesperson before. But let's go and look at one of your other HBR articles, which you called How to Explain Your Career Transition. And you talk about the fact that shifting careers is often very hard to explain. And you suggest that the most important step in getting others on board with your career transition is to craft a compelling narrative. Can you tell us a little bit more about this idea, and why is that key? And what practical advice do you have for our listeners who would like to craft their own story?
Well, one of the aspects of professional reinvention that I think is often overlooked is the narrative element. And this is something I talk about quite a bit in my first book, Reinventing You. And part of the reason why I think this is so important is that it comes as a bit of a surprise to people sometimes, and it can blindside them. So I really think it's important to shine a light on it so people are prepared. We often assume that if we are doing a career transition of some kind, that our biggest boosters, our biggest supporters are going to be the people closest to us, our close friends, our family. And in some cases, that's true, which is wonderful. But actually, in a lot of cases, they are the ones that often might be the biggest obstacles or the biggest naysayers. And they they have good reasons, right? I mean, if it's a stranger, I mean, they don't care, okay, Claire, you can tell me you're a professional botanist. And I'd be like, oh, fantastic. Good job, Claire. Like, I mean, who am I to say, oh no, Claire, you're not a botanist, you're a barber, So it's like for strangers, they don't care. They're happy to accept whatever. But for your own family, I mean, first of all, there's a piece of economic self-interest, like, oh, can she really support herself as a botanist? Can she support me as a botanist? But also there is altruism, although, sometimes perhaps misplaced, because they often sometimes act like, oh, clearly you've never thought about the downside of this. You must have just really glossed that over. Let me inform you about all the pitfalls. And it's like, excuse me, you think I haven't thought about this? And you feel like you're being lectured or you're not being supported. And so meanwhile, you're just acting at cross purposes. That can be really hard and painful and distracting from the work that you need to be doing, which is actually getting yourself established in this new profession rather than having fights over identity. So I think being aware that your friends and family are actually a constituency is really important. We have to convince them early on that we are both serious about it, that this is not a passing fad, and that we are capable of doing this and making this transition. And it seems stupid and unnecessary that we somehow have to convince them. But the truth is we do, because we need to get them on our side so that
we need our peers. We need our tribe.
That's right. So narrative and how we tell the story and explaining it in a way that can help people make sense of like, oh, she used to do this, but oh, now she's doing that. Okay, that makes sense. It's rather basic, but it is an important step we often overlook to our peril.
Absolutely. Let's talk about mitigating risk in a person's career. We know that none of us, you, me, anyone, apart from monarchs, I guess, but even them sometimes, no one's protected from the risk of losing their job. And this has been especially true during the pandemic. There's been the heavy negatives and the heavy positives. You're making a point that it's important to make that we're protected from potential risks that could threaten our vision of the future. You have a framework that can help anyone identify and mitigate career risks. Can you tell us more about how to protect ourselves against career downsides, perhaps with some examples?
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Well, this is certainly, as we were talking about earlier, a topic that I'm particularly invested in. You always get a little bit emblazoned by your personal experiences, especially when they happen at formative times. And so in addition to getting laid off from my first job as a journalist, which, getting laid off from your first job is often memorable in not a great way. What made it even more meaningful in terms of searing itself into my psyche was the fact that I happened to get laid off on Monday, September 10th, 2001. And I was a reporter in Boston. Boston, of course, was the site of where the planes for 9/11 took off from. Yep. So it was a rather central piece in the puzzle. I was a political reporter. I would have been reporting on this, but I stayed home that day because I no longer had a job. And I had been planning and assuming like, oh, okay, well, I guess I'm going to spend today pounding the pavement and job hunting. And that was certainly not happening that day. And it became extraordinarily challenging because there was massive economic upheaval. There was all kinds of upheaval, but there also was economic upheaval in the wake of 9/11, and just no one was hiring. Everyone had a hiring freeze. So it became a very, very fraught period for me financially. And I realized, oh, like we need to have a backup plan. If you have one job, it is secure until it is not secure. It's very risky for anything where you have something that is 100% full and then it can go to 0% full. And that is why I have become a huge believer. And this was really the topic of my most recent book, Entrepreneurial You. It's about how to create multiple revenue streams in your business. Yeah. And people think about this maybe a little bit more if they're an entrepreneur. They say, oh, well, I can create a new service offering or a new product line or something like that. And that's of course good. But I really want to emphasize it is important as a backup, even if you are fully employed, even if you have a day job. And I mean, just as one example, this is the kind of thing I wish I had done. in Entrepreneurial You, I profile a guy named Pat Flynn. Pat Flynn worked at an architecture firm, and he, was all keen on becoming an architect. And this was around 2008. He had been studying for a green building certification, and he started putting his study notes up online on a website, mostly for him, but he figured, oh, maybe other people can benefit from this too. And so he created that. And then at a certain point, he thought, I wonder if anyone would pay for this. Like if I actually put it into a book instead of just like web pages, would anybody buy the book as like a study guide? And so he decided to try it really as an experiment. I mean, it doesn't cost a lot of money since he had already assembled it, and he was just selling it as a PDF. And he put it up for sale. And the great news was that within a couple of months, he actually, mind you, he wasn't making a lot of the architecture firm, but he was making more money every month from selling these online ebooks than he was from his architecture job. And this turned out to be very handy because in 2008, he got laid off from his architecture job with a financial crisis. So he had something to turn to. And that's what I want for other people. I mean, since you raised it, if folks are interested, I actually have a free Entrepreneurial You self-assessment that helps people think through how to create new revenue streams in their business. And anyone can get it for free at dorieclark.com/entrepreneur. But I really think this is one of the best things that we can do to protect ourselves, is to think about just, it doesn't have to be big, but just starting now to create a little something on the side as an insurance policy.
It's so crucial. And we'll make sure that we publish the link to that particular assessment for sure. Let's go on to the thorny but exciting subject of building networks. We've got 2 questions for you today based on our own experience coaching professionals in their careers. The first one is, what advice do you have for those who are reluctant to network? Whether that's because they don't believe in the value of doing so, or because they're not that comfortable doing it.
Well, I think there's a couple of things at play. The first is really a framing issue, because most of the people who are uncomfortable with networking are, I think, reacting to a very particular definition of networking. And I want to rebut that definition of networking, because what they're responding to is bad networking. And okay, you don't like bad networking? Good, me neither. So good networking, as I would define it, is really just nothing more than just making friends. And I think most people actually like to make friends. I mean, I suppose there's some outliers, but most people, if it's like, oh, hey, do you want to have a chance to meet cool people that you can hang out with? I mean, like, okay, yeah. So I think, first of all, we have to realize that that's the case. Now, I actually wrote an article recently for the Wall Street Journal about this. The issue that seems to bother most people about networking, if you dig a little bit deeper, and Francesca Gino at Harvard and her colleagues have done some good research into this, is what actually seems to be the factor that troubles people is if they worry that they either are or look like they will be using people in some way. It's transactional networking that bothers them. And I think if we can just take that off the table, I in the long game, I created a rule called no asks for a year. And to me, I think this is a very clear way to just be like, hey, that's not what I'm about. And that is, if you meet somebody new, if you make a contact, you just vow to yourself, you're not going to ask them for anything for a year. Now, I don't mean like friend things like, hey, do you want to go to the park with me? Or like, hey, can you, tell me who your barber is, your cool Montenegrin barber? But I mean an ask that involves political capital, a favor kind of ask.
Absolutely.
And if we just stay away from that, then it really enables us to just focus on making friends and keeping the networking pure, so that later on, when you're already friends, you're going to do things for each other organically. And it's not even going to matter. It's not even going to be thought of as like, oh, it's a big favor, because it's just what people do for their friends.
That's so true. And it goes back to the real basics of, if what you're doing is meeting a bunch of new friendly, even if they're not friends, friendly acquaintances, then why wouldn't you help each other, serve each other like we do anyway? So you're right. It's de-dramatizing all of this. Now, assuming we've de-dramatized it and people are doing it, and then we've got, COVID, no events and all those kinds of things. Even if we are opening up in some cases, things are not the same. What do you have as suggestions for alternative and effective ways to network now that these face-to-face events have decreased somewhat and the virtual or hybrid is becoming the new normal?
Yes. So I have also thought about this quite a lot and written a couple of articles during the pandemic for HBR with my colleague Alyssa Cohn about virtual networking, because one of the things that we did during COVID, I was often, sometimes by myself and sometimes with Alyssa, we would often have dinner parties in New York pre-COVID, which was great. You know, I mean, people loved meeting and it was really fun. But the interesting thing, there are, of course, disadvantages to doing things on Zoom, often largely that people are super burned out from being on Zoom all day. I think some of us are beginning to sort of understand that and kind of strategize a little better about it now. But there was a period during parts of COVID where it's just complete overwhelm.
And there will be no amounts of cocktails or funny jokes or funny games that are going to make us enjoy this. Yeah,
absolutely. But there were actually some interesting advantages, because previously when it came to networking, if somebody, you know, you'd say, oh, where do you live? And they'd tell you. And if it was not in New York, then pretty much my answer was like, well, great. Let me know when you're in New York. and then, you know, that was kind of it. Or maybe I would be visiting their city and I could look them up there, but it was a little bit hit or miss. And I was not actively or proactively cultivating those connections. And during COVID, what I realized was, oh, well, with virtual cocktails, which again, I mean, we were in the early phase, we were doing them couple times a month, you know, even sometimes every week. Like, we were doing a lot because you weren't seeing anybody otherwise. So it was kind of your only game in town. But now I think done sparingly, it actually can be quite powerful, because what I realized is like, oh, you can have a party with people from all over the country, or sometimes depending on the time zone, all around the world. And this legitimately, even more than bringing people together in one particular city, those folks might run into each other. If you're having a party with people from around the world, odds are they're probably not going to run into each other. So it really does increase the ability for serendipity.
Absolutely. The idea that we can cross paths in different ways is so powerful, especially when you take it away from the burnout that we definitely got to. Now let's talk a little bit then about this new book of yours, The Long Game. I love the title even before having read it. It appeals to every bone and cell in my body. It was just published last month. Tell me, first of all, what compelled you to write this book now?
So The Long Game, of course, in terms of its gestation, I was interested in writing it pre-COVID. I started the process and wrote the proposal pre-COVID. And at the time, what I was focused on was just, you know, probably two factors, like a micro factor and a macro factor. Macro factor was seeing all of the stories about corporate malfeasance, almost all of which are tied to a desire for shortcuts and a desire for like, oh, we have to hit the quarterly earnings. And so they invent things or they lie about things or whatever. And it's just, it's so, you know, we realize post facto, so counterproductive. But obviously, even smart, very intelligent people who should have known better, did know better, nonetheless engaged in it because they felt such acute short-term pressure. So that was interesting to me in this kind of morbid way. But also, I felt the same thing happening in our own lives, because almost all of us in one fashion or another, you know, we're toting around our smartphones. We have social media, and what social media does is it is essentially a 24-hour comparison engine. There's a saying that I quote in The Long Game that I love. It's a quote from H.L. Mencken, who was this sort of satirist about 100 years ago. And he said that like true wealth, true success is making $100 a year more than your brother-in-law does. And I thought that was pretty funny. But also in our modern society, it's a little bit not funny, because we're not just comparing ourselves to our brother-in-law. Like, everyone is your brother-in-law on Instagram. You're looking around and like, oh my God, my third grade classmate, why does he have that Lamborghini? Or, you know, oh, this like 17-year-old influencer has 5 million followers. Like, what am I doing wrong? And I think, I saw, certainly to some extent in myself, but in a lot of my clients who were, struggling to get their voices heard and looking to build their business and build their platform, there was just this hunger and this frustration of like, why is it taking so long? Why is it not working for me? Why is it working so well for everyone else? Mm-hmm. And it's a dangerous path and an unhelpful path to go down. I think, we have to run our own race. And I wanted to write with a long game, a book to try to help good people be able to cross through that tunnel, that really hard, dark tunnel in between coming up with a vision of success and actually attaining it, to be able to persevere through the period where you're not getting a lot of feedback, you're not getting a lot of inputs, you don't know if it's working, but you have to keep going in order to get to that other side and get what you want.
Fantastic. And in many ways, I guess the central theme of the book is strategic planning of some kind and how to optimize short-term efforts while actually thinking in the long term. And that kind of sounds obvious for many business professionals, but it's often more difficult to reconcile our day-to-day activities with the bigger picture, or indeed to want to. Why is that? And how can we start to play the long game?
Yeah, well, I think, it's not dissimilar to a lot of things in life where we want to do something and it kind of doesn't quite happen. But there, as humans, of course, right, we're sort of fighting our natural tendency. If you have a choice between now and later, now sounds nice. let's do that. The sort of classic example of this, of course, is the Walter Mischel marshmallow study, where they have the little kids and, okay, 1 marshmallow if you have it now, or 2 marshmallows if you wait 15 minutes. And I think for all of us, it's kind of this question of like, okay, we would like to have things now, but if there is a significant chance that waiting a little bit and being a little bit patient could get us double the outcome, maybe we should do that. And, almost everybody's heard of that study, but I think some of the more subtle points of it are worth unpacking, because the thing that I thought was very powerful is it is not a fixed situation. It is not that just, well, some kids are patient and some kids aren't, and that's all there is. There's nothing you can do about it. Actually, it turns out there's techniques that you can teach kids to enable them to become more patient. You can actually give them strategies that enable them to become far more efficient at being able to wait for that outcome. And that's, of course, equally true for adults, that if we are methodical about really focusing on understanding, okay, I really do want to work toward this, I really want to optimize for this, we also can become what I call more strategically patient. And the way I define that, I am not really a fan of sort of classic patience, which I think so often comes out in the form of like, oh, just sit back and magic things will happen. Like that's not my jam. That sounds a little froofy to me. What I am interested in, I'm not interested in patience really at all. I don't love it, but we have to deal with it because that is sort of the necessary terms of engagement in order to get the large scale goals accomplished that we want. But strategic patience for me is about, it's sort of a more active form of patience. It's like, okay, let's form the hypothesis. Let's try something. Let's see if that thing is working. Let's monitor it. Let's change it if we need to. And let's recognize all the while, it's probably going to take longer than we want. And that sucks, but we know it and we're going to deal with it. And we are going to monitor this situation and keep moving forward until we reach the goal that we want.
Fantastic. So let's think of some sort of visible high achievers that you can give us as examples of those who've understand the importance of what you're calling strategic patience, this necessity to focus on the enduring power of curiosity and resilience. Who would be great examples that you could tell us about?
Yeah, well, if we're talking about a sort of well-known celebrity, for all that he's current, these waves of things, right? For all that he's in the news about problems at Blue Origin and what have you at the moment, Jeff Bezos really, I think, was an exemplar of this at Amazon. And something that I thought was quite significant, about 10 years ago, he did an interview with Wired magazine, and he was asked about what he thought was the secret to Amazon's success. And of course, we know 10 years later, Amazon is even more successful than it was a decade ago. And he said something that I thought was quite interesting. He said that most other companies are only willing to invest on a 3-year horizon. So meaning you make an investment and it needs to pay off within 3 years. He said Amazon thinks differently, and they are willing to invest on a 7-year horizon. So they are willing to make longer term investments that might take longer to build and to percolate, but can, as a result, it's a bigger goal. It's a more ambitious goal, and it has the potential to pay off in a dramatically larger fashion. This is not just about, oh, I think that the button should be green. It's about, oh, I think we should create a new business line that's Amazon Web Services. And, of course, it ends up spitting out billions of dollars per year. And so just being willing to have that extra level of patience and not needing to show the results quite so quickly, that can be very powerful in terms of the ultimate results that you're able to derive.
Fantastic. And would you be willing to share in some sort of anonymous fashion a comparable example of somebody maybe that you've coached or consulted to, who may well be, not that well known, but who went the journey with you hand in hand?
Yeah, absolutely. And this does not even have to be anonymous because she's in the book, but a wonderful friend and client of mine is a woman named Ann Sugar. And she is, a really excellent executive coach. She coaches for Harvard Business School executive education. She, a lot of top companies, writes for Harvard Business Review. And the story that I tell about her in the book is that she was writing for another different business publication, and she was writing for them, just as a way of getting her ideas out there, sort of building her brand and her platform. So for free. She was writing for these folks for 6 months. She did 35 articles for them. She had done a lot of articles. And so after all of this work for free, about 6 months in, her editor, who incidentally was 2 years out of college, says to her that they're firing her from her free position. And they said, sorry, we thought about it and you're just not creative enough. Oh. Just talk about profound mistreatment. I want to smack this young lady because it's just so offensive to every professional to be treated in that way. Oh, it was good enough to publish 35 of my articles, and now you're firing me from the free job, huh? And it's terrible. But that, of course, is the kind of thing that for so many people could really derail them and derail their efforts. It's like our big nightmare is to get sort of dissed in that way. But Anne did it exactly right. She reached out to a bunch of friends and colleagues, looking for advice, looking for support, as you should. And a lot of people gave her very helpful advice and encouragement. But actually what stuck out to her most was there was one woman that she reached out to and said, oh my gosh, I'm feeling so bad. Has anything like this ever happened to you? And the woman said, oh yeah, like pretty much almost the exact same thing happened to me. And Anne said, well, what did you do? And the woman said, oh, well, I never wrote again.
Oh my God.
And realized, oh, wow. Like that's one end of the spectrum. That's the, like the devil on your shoulder being like, you don't need to do this. Just walk away. And she realized that was not what she wanted to do. That was not the answer for her, to give up and to quit. And so that actually ended up sparking her resolve even more. And so within a couple of months, she had networked her way into writing for another publication that she continues to write for to this day, another equally prestigious publication. But, I have a whole last section of the long game where I talk about overcoming these gatekeepers and these setbacks, because inevitably, if we have a big enough or a meaningful enough goal, we are going to be faced with situations like this, just, stuff out of our control. Somebody doesn't like what we're doing. but we have to keep going. And I think that Anne is a wonderful example of being able to persevere successfully through that.
Fantastic. That's a lovely story. It's great to see the slightly smaller scale, smaller scope people, even if she sounds wonderfully impressive, being able to benefit from this wonderful long-term view. Let's talk about optimizing for interesting, which is one of your themes. It directly links to how people approach their careers. Indeed, we're often told to follow our passion, but a lot of people don't really know how to do that or find it hard to know what their passion is. Instead, you're saying go for the things you find interesting. Can you give us some concrete examples of how one should indeed optimize for interesting?
Yeah, well, where this comes from, I, about a decade ago, was directing a documentary film. It was just, a small environmental documentary film. And it was about this woman, this, very impressive 1960s housewife who led almost single-handedly the cleanup of one of America's most polluted rivers. And so we were digging in to try to understand, well, what motivated her? How did she know how to do this? How did she get behind it? And she told a story that when she was on her way out the door to college, her mother's last piece of advice to her was, whenever you have a choice of what to do, choose the more interesting path. And I thought, wow, well, that's a good rule of thumb. I mean, of course, the truth is sometimes we don't have a choice and we just have to do the thing we need to do. But sometimes we do. Yeah. And when we do have that choice, choosing something that will lead to a non-conventional outcome or a non-conventional experience can really be fascinating and transformative. And, I like this advice as well, because I think there's a lot of pressure in our society around, finding your passion. And it's a very high bar. Well, oh my God, what is my passion? How do I know it's my passion? Is it really my passion? And it stresses a lot of people out.
And indeed, do I even need to be passionate, or would being really enthusiastic be enough?
Yeah, absolutely. And so for me, optimize for interesting is kind of I think a gentler version of that, because, okay, optimize for your passion. Well, maybe if you have a passion, God bless, go for it. But if you don't know what your passion is, or if it just doesn't feel right, I mean, clearly you don't want to be doing something you hate. That's not good advice for anybody. But optimize for interesting, I think, is a good compromise. It's let's lower the bar a little bit. Doesn't have to be the be all and end all, but choose something that you find fascinating and just keep moving toward that as long as you can. Oh, okay. Is this continuing to be interesting? Great. Let's just keep doing more of that. And it will almost inevitably lead you in a good direction if you are following your curiosity.
Dorie, that's fantastic. And it's perhaps a great note on which to finish. This idea of interesting, however it shows up, is certainly something that I can unequivocally say about our conversation today. You've come up with some very clear ideas and answers around how we can all, with relatively simple methods, improve our path through our careers. Simple, but not necessarily easy to apply. Often based on good common sense, but even more difficult to apply. I am looking forward to referring our listeners to, not only to your books, but also to your assessments that will allow them to take yet another, but they're all important, view of where they are and where they're going and what they want. And I'm just incredibly grateful to you for having spent the time with us at a very busy period of your life. And so thank you.
Claire, thank you so much. Really great to get to speak with you today.
We hope you enjoyed hearing from this month's guest as much as we did.
Do go and check out our work on disrupt-your-career.com and come back soon. Thank you.